Welcome to Twist of Revenge, where we tell stories that don't just entertain but stay with you long after the screen fades to black. If family, forgiveness, and the quiet moments that define who we are matter to you, this might be a good place to settle in. Take a moment to subscribe not just for the stories we share, but for the truths you might find in them. Today's story is titled, "I didn't invite my father to my wedding, but he came anyway with a secret that made everyone cry." Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Space a Mother Leaves Behind. They say weddings are about beginnings, about two lives becoming one, about flowers and candles and forever vows. But for me, it started with something that had ended a long time ago. My mother. She died when I was 7. I don't remember the last words she said to me. What I do remember is the silence after, the kind of silence that moves into a house and never really leaves. I remember how the house felt colder, how my father seemed smaller, how nothing in the world made sense anymore. People told me to be strong. They told me that time heals all things. But what they never told me was that grief doesn't vanish. It just changes shape. And sometimes that shape becomes a wall between you and the only parent you have left. That wall grew between my father and me, slowly then suddenly. His name is David. To the world, he was a quiet man who worked with his hands, fixed things that were broken. But to me, he was the man who didn't cry at my mother's funeral. He was the man who stopped singing in the mornings. He was the man who, when I needed someone to tell me it would all be okay, just sat in silence. At 7, that silence felt like abandonment. At 17, it felt like resentment. By 27, I had stopped calling him Dad. When Ryan proposed to me on a foggy morning by the lake, kneeling on a flat stone just like in the movies, I said yes with every piece of my heart. It was a new chapter, a new family. And I promised myself one thing: the past wouldn't come with me down the aisle. That's why, when it came time to write the guest list, I skipped his name. Not because I didn't know it, but because I knew it too well. "Emily, are you sure?" my aunt asked, hesitating as she looked at the final list. I nodded. He doesn't belong there. And in that moment, I believed it. But what I didn't know, not then, not yet, was that the man I thought had forgotten me had been watching all along. That love doesn't always arrive with grand gestures or loud apologies. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in envelopes, in bills quietly paid. Sometimes it walks into your wedding uninvited, carrying nothing but a fragile truth and a heart full of secrets. And that is where the real story begins. Studio Chapter 2, The Man Who Stopped Showing Up. There are things that fathers are expected to do. Walk you to school, tie your skates, read the bedtime story even when they are tired. And then there are the things that are never said out loud but always expected. To fight for you, to shield you from the kind of sorrow that leaves a permanent mark. When Mom died, I waited for him to do those things, to wrap me in his arms and promise that we'd be okay. But he didn't. He came home late. He fixed the kitchen sink 3 times, even though it wasn't broken. He stood in the hallway outside my bedroom like he wanted to knock, but never did. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, not just because she was gone, but because he had gone too in a different way. And over the years, that absence hardened into something I never dared say out loud. I don't need him. He missed my school plays. He missed my piano recitals. One year, he forgot my birthday. When I graduated college, I searched the crowd for him just once. He wasn't there. Later, I'd find out he'd been parked 2 blocks away, sitting in his truck with a tie still knotted awkwardly around his collar. He watched from a distance. He always watched from a distance. But by then, it was too late. Too many missed moments, too many unopened envelopes. He had become a stranger with my last name. Ryan didn't ask many questions when I told him about my dad. He just squeezed my hand gently and said, "Whatever you need, I'm with you." That was all I ever wanted, someone to stand beside me without making me justify the cracks in my story. We moved on with wedding plans, flowers, photographers, the tasting menu. I wanted everything to be perfect. And it was mostly, except for one odd thing. One day, when we went to finalize the contract with the venue, the coordinator smiled and said, "Oh, don't worry, your balance is already paid in full." I blinked. "Sorry, what?" She double-checked the screen. "Paid last week, anonymous sponsor." I stared at Ryan. He shook his head. It wasn't me. The same thing happened with the bakery and the string quartet and the florist. Every time I pulled out my credit card, someone else had already paid. It was flattering in a strange way. Maybe a relative, maybe Ryan's parents, but no one admitted to it. And over time, I convinced myself not to think too much about it. Maybe this was just the universe saying, "You've had enough pain, Emily. Let this day be beautiful." One morning, I found a plain envelope in the mail, no return address. My name written in blocky, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a card. "For your wedding. I hope it's everything you dreamed of, D." That was all. No signature, no explanation, just that single letter at the bottom. I didn't have to wonder who it was from. I ripped it in half without reading it again. Because you don't get to leave and then show up through money and mailboxes. You don't get to be absent for years and then buy your way back in. Or at least that's what I told myself. Still, I didn't throw the pieces away. I left them on the kitchen table. I didn't tell Ryan. And later that night, when I got up for a glass of water, I found myself taping the two halves back together. I told myself it was nothing. But something inside me stirred. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but a question I couldn't shake. Why now? Studio Chapter 3. A name that wasn't written down. When the invitations were sent, I remember the silence in the room. It was just me and the final list, rows of names printed in elegant script, RSVP cards tucked neatly inside cream-colored envelopes. I hovered over one space for too long. Father of the bride, a blank line that didn't stay blank by accident. I skipped it, not because I forgot, but because I remembered too much. Ryan looked over my shoulder. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "He won't care." What I didn't say was that I cared too much, that seeing his name next to mine would feel like rewriting history, and I wasn't ready for that. Later that evening, I called my aunt, the only one on my mother's side I still kept in touch with regularly. "Emily," she said gently, "I know this isn't easy, but he's still your father. He stopped being my father when Mom died," I said, sharper than I meant to. "He let go, so I did too." She was quiet, and then she said something that stayed with me. "Sometimes people grieve in ways that look a lot like leaving." I wanted to brush her words off. I wanted to believe my pain had a clear villain, but her voice lingered in the back of my mind like a song I couldn't forget. So when I got home, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I opened the old shoebox in the back of my closet, the one I had promised myself I'd never open. Inside were all the envelopes I never read. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, random notes in shaky handwriting, all signed, "Love, Dad." One of them had a tiny paper star inside, folded from a receipt. Another just said, "I was proud of you today. I always am." I don't know why I kept them if I never wanted to read them. Maybe I needed proof that he tried, even if I wasn't ready to see it at the time. That night, I sat on the floor surrounded by the fragments of a man I had refused to see for years, and for the first time I wondered what it must have been like for him, to send words into a silence that never answered, to knock on a door that stayed locked. Grief doesn't come with instructions, and love doesn't always look the way we want it to. Still, I didn't invite him. The decision had already been made. The venue was finalized, the guest list printed. The seat next to me at the rehearsal dinner had already been assigned to someone else. And yet, even as I crossed his name out in my mind, I started to wonder what would happen if he showed up anyway, not for me, but because some doors once knocked on never really close. Studio Chapter 4, The Man Outside the Glass. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the week before the wedding, when it happened. The bridal shop sat on the corner of 4th and Maple, its window display filled with ivory gowns and glittering veils. My appointment was at 2:00, and for once I wasn't nervous. The dress had already been chosen weeks ago. This was just a final fitting, minor adjustments, a few finishing touches. Inside, the room buzzed with the usual energy, mirrors, laughter, champagne flutes. My best friend Olivia spun in circles, modeling a bridesmaid's dress too poofy for comfort. The seamstress tugged at the hem of my gown, murmuring something about length. And then, for just a second, I looked up. Through the shop's wide glass window, I saw him. A man standing across the street, motionless beneath the awning of a bookstore that hadn't been open in years. He wasn't doing anything, just watching. His hands were tucked into his coat pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he wasn't sure if he was cold or just unsure of his place in the world. Even from that distance, I knew the shape of him, the way he stood like he was bracing for rejection. It was my father. I blinked. When I looked again, he was gone. I didn't say anything, not to Olivia, not to the seamstress, not even to Ryan later that night, when he rubbed my shoulders and asked how the fitting went. Perfect, I said. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The next day, the same thing happened, different location. I was walking out of the florist's studio, bouquet in hand, surrounded by the scent of lavender and roses, when I saw the figure again. Across the street this time, sitting on a bench outside a hardware store, reading a folded newspaper but not turning a single page. My father didn't come any closer. He didn't wave. He didn't call my name. He just watched. Not in a creepy way, not like a stalker or a stranger, more like someone who was used to watching life happen from the sidelines. For years I had told myself he didn't care, that he had moved on. But what do you do with a man who shows up to the edge of your life again and again, and never crosses the threshold? Do you call it love, or guilt, or something in between? The following night another envelope arrived. Same handwriting, same lack of return address. Inside, a folded note. I saw you today, you looked beautiful just like her. No name, just the letter D again. I didn't rip this one. I didn't even pretend to be angry. I just sat on the couch for a long time, holding that slip of paper like it might vanish if I looked away. There's something cruel about grief. It rearranges the furniture in your memory. You forget what someone smelled like, but remember the sound of their footsteps. You forget their laugh, but remember the way they folded their arms when they were nervous. And just like that, the man I had spent so long trying to erase was beginning to take shape again. In the corners of my life, I still didn't pick up the phone. I still didn't send an invitation. But that night I caught myself wondering what color tie he might wear if he came. Not because I wanted him there, but because for the first time in a very, very long while, I wasn't entirely sure I didn't. Chapter 5. The Gift That Had No Name. The first bill that vanished was the cake. It was a 3-tier almond vanilla buttercream with sugared violets. A splurge, really. Ryan and I had agreed to think about it, to sleep on the decision before committing. But when I called the bakery back the next morning, the owner smiled through the phone. "Oh, it's already been taken care of," she said. I paused. "What do you mean?" "Paid in full, same day you came in." "By who?" She hesitated. "They asked to stay anonymous. Just left a note that said, 'Congratulations, Emily.'" I didn't tell Ryan. I told myself it must be his parents or one of my aunts trying to do something nice. But when I casually asked around, no one admitted to it. Then it happened again. The lighting vendor, the deposit for the quartet, the vintage car I dreamed of renting just for the photos, all paid, all anonymously, each with the same note. "Congratulations, Emily." I wanted to believe it was a blessing, some wedding miracle. But the more it happened, the more it felt like something else entirely. Not a gift, a presence, like someone was quietly filling in the cracks of everything I couldn't afford to finish on my own. One evening I came home to find a package at the door. No name, no postage, just wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Inside was a silk handkerchief embroidered with my mother's initials. Delicate, worn, still faintly smelling of lavender. I hadn't seen it since I was a child. She used to carry it in her purse, always folded, never used. She'd once told me, "Some things are for remembering, not for wiping away." I stood in the hallway for a long time, holding that square of fabric like it might fall apart if I breathed too hard. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing his figure outside the bridal shop, the way he didn't knock, the way he didn't ask to be let in. And now these gifts, these invisible hands smoothing the path ahead, while never daring to step onto it. Ryan noticed something was off. We were finalizing the seating chart when he looked up and asked, "Are you okay?" I forced a smile. "Just tired." He leaned in, studying my face like someone reading between the lines. "You sure this is what you want?" he asked gently. "This wedding, this clean break?" I wanted to say yes, but the words didn't come because something had shifted, something unspoken, something real. I didn't have the courage to name it yet. But it was there, growing slowly, like light seeping under a door I had kept closed for far too long. Chapter 6. The last letter I never meant to read. It arrived on a Sunday. I found it tucked between grocery flyers and a coupon booklet. Plain white envelope, familiar handwriting, no return address again. But this time something was different. The paper was heavier, the ink deeper, more deliberate. And on the back, where a seal might have gone, there was a single pressed violet. Dried, fragile, just like the ones in Mom's old garden. I almost threw it away. My fingers trembled as I held it over the trash can, heart pounding, breath stuck somewhere between my throat and my chest. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the violet. Maybe it was the ache that had been growing quietly in my ribcage these past few weeks. I walked to the couch, sat down slowly, and broke the seal. Inside, just one page, folded in thirds. The kind of letter you don't write unless you've been thinking about it for years. "Emily, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't expect you to. I've written dozens like it over the years. Most never got mailed. Some you probably threw away. I wouldn't blame you. There are things I've wanted to say since the day your mother died, but I didn't know how, and the longer I waited, the harder it became. Silence has a way of hardening around the heart. You think you're protecting yourself, but really you're just losing the people you love, one quiet day at a time. I failed you, I know that. Not because I stopped loving you, but because I didn't know how to show it in a world without her. You were 7. And I was a man who had never done a single school pickup, never packed a lunchbox, never braided hair or read bedtime stories without her voice in the next room. I thought I had more time. And then I didn't. I grieved by fixing things, pipes, fences, door hinges. Things I could control, but you weren't something to be fixed. You were a child who needed a father, and I wasn't one. Not then. You stopped looking at me one day. You stopped asking questions, so I learned to watch from afar. You grew. You lived. You thrived without me. And I told myself that was enough. But it never was. Emily, I know you didn't invite me to your wedding. I know you have every reason not to, but if you're reading this, I want you to know one thing. I never stopped showing up. I just didn't know how to be seen. You don't owe me forgiveness. But if there's a corner in your heart where my name still fits, I'll be standing there, always. Love, Dad. When I finished, my hands were shaking. Not from anger, but from the weight of it all. From the years lost between two people who didn't know how to speak the same language anymore. I didn't cry, not right away. Instead, I stared at the pressed violet on the table, and suddenly I remembered. I was 5. My mother had just come back from the hospital, tired but smiling. I picked her a flower from the garden. She pressed it between 2 pages of a cookbook and said, "Let's save this. Someday we'll need to remember something soft." I closed the letter slowly, carefully, like it might tear if I moved too quickly. And for the first time in years, I didn't call him David in my mind. I called him Dad, just once, quietly, like a prayer I wasn't sure anyone would hear. Chapter 7, the chair left empty. The rehearsal dinner was held in the back room of a small Italian restaurant. Warm lighting, long wooden tables, wine glasses that clinked too easily. Everything had been arranged just so. Place cards in gold script. Mismatched chairs that looked rustic but were chosen carefully. Fresh rosemary tied with twine at each napkin fold. And then there was the chair. It sat at the end of the table opposite Ryan's father. Unclaimed, unassigned. I told everyone it was in case a +1 showed up, but I knew it was for someone else. I spent most of the evening trying not to look at it. I laughed at Olivia's toast. I smiled for the pictures. I even clinked my glass with Ryan's during the final blessing, but my eyes kept drifting back. To that one seat. It wasn't particularly different from the others, just an old wooden chair, a little worn on one side. But somehow it felt louder than any voice in the room. "Did someone not show?" The manager asked gently, glancing at the chair. I shook my head. "No, it's fine." He offered to remove it. I told him no. And for the rest of the night it stayed there, like a question I couldn't answer, like a wound I wasn't ready to expose. Later, as the evening wound down, Ryan pulled me aside. His tie was loosened, his eyes kind. "You've been somewhere else tonight," he said quietly. "I'm right here," I replied. He shook his head. "Your body's here, but your heart, it's standing in some doorway you're afraid to walk through." I looked away. "Did he write again?" Ryan asked, softer now. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because the answer wasn't in a letter anymore. It was sitting right there at the end of the table. When the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, I stood in front of that chair and finally allowed myself to feel it. Not just the absence, but the ache of all the years it had taken me to get here. The years of silence, the unopened letters, the unanswered questions. The girl who had once waited at the window for her father to come home, and the woman who had spent most of her adult life pretending she no longer cared if he did. I ran my hand across the top of the chair. It was smooth from years of use. I wondered what my father's hands would look like resting there. Rough, probably, strong. the hands of a man who worked with wood and tools and mistakes he couldn't take back. Then I whispered, so quiet only the room could hear it. I don't know if I want you here, but I don't know if I want you gone either. I left the chair where it was, didn't fold it, didn't move it, and as I walked out of the room, I looked over my shoulder one last time. It was still empty, but for the first time, it didn't feel as empty as it used to. Studio Chapter 8, The Wedding Morning. The morning of my wedding began with clouds, not the heavy kind that threatens rain, but the soft, silver kind that settles in early, quiet and unsure of its place in the sky. There was stillness in the air, as if the world knew something important was about to happen and didn't want to disturb it. Inside the bridal suite, everyone was buzzing. Curling irons hummed. Perfume mist hung in the air. Champagne popped in the background while laughter rose and fell in waves. But I stood at the window holding a mug of tea I wasn't drinking, watching the driveway below like it might offer me an answer I hadn't yet asked. "Earth to Emily," Olivia teased gently, pinning one last curl behind my ear. Still thinking about the seating chart. I smiled, not answering. The truth was no, I wasn't thinking about the seating chart. I was thinking about a different kind of arrangement, one where there was no aisle, no music, just a man across the street, watching from behind glass. There's something strange about the morning you get married. The world looks familiar, but it doesn't feel the same. Every sound is sharper, every silence is louder. You remember things without meaning to. The way your mother brushed your hair on the first day of school. The way your father's boots used to sit by the back door. The way you once believed everyone who left would come back eventually. I stared at myself in the mirror, layers of silk and lace pulled tight across my ribs, and wondered if he was thinking of me today, if he had woken up early, if he knew where the church was, if he was standing outside somewhere, hands in pockets, heart caught in the space between memory and regret, because I hadn't invited him and he hadn't said he'd come, but a part of me knew he would. There was no logic to the feeling, no proof, only this quiet truth that had been building inside me since the letters began arriving, since the gifts were paid for, since the handkerchief that smelled like lavender reappeared after all these years. He had stayed away when I wanted him close, and now that I had pushed him away, he was closer than ever. "Ready?" Olivia asked, holding out my bouquet. I took it with both hands, fingers shaking slightly beneath the petals, as the door opened and my bridal party lined up to walk down the aisle. I turned once more toward the window. There were cars parked in front of the church. A man standing beside a rusted blue truck, wearing a gray suit, a little wrinkled, a little too big in the shoulders. He wasn't looking at the building. He was looking at the steeple, looking up, as if asking for permission, or maybe forgiveness. I looked away before I could be sure, and when I stepped onto the marble floor, as the music began to rise, I told myself it doesn't matter if he came, but the truth was, it mattered more than anything else. Studio Chapter 9, the moment he walked in. The church doors closed behind me with a soft echo, sealing the outside world behind thick oak and stained glass. Inside, everything shimmered. The aisle stretched long and gleaming, a delicate path between past and future, framed in white petals and flickering candles. Ryan stood at the end of it, smiling that kind of quiet smile he only gave when he was holding back something bigger than words. Everyone else turned to look at me. Mothers, cousins, friends, strangers, all leaning ever so slightly into the moment. But I couldn't look at anyone, not yet, because something inside me was waiting. A pause, a space, like a held breath that didn't know how to exhale. The ceremony began, vows were read, Tears came from all the usual places: mother's hands, bridesmaids' mascara, father's clutching programs too tightly. But I noticed something as I stood beneath the arch, holding Ryan's hands between mine. The ushers had quietly opened the back doors. A draft moved through the sanctuary, and just beyond the last row of pews, where no one was assigned, where no nameplate waited, stood a man. He didn't sit. He didn't move. He simply stood at the threshold, half in light, half in shadow. My father. He wasn't wearing the tie I imagined. It was worse. A button-up shirt too stiff at the collar, slacks that didn't quite match his jacket, hair combed with water, shoes polished too much, trying in the only way he knew how. His hands were empty, no gift, no camera, just that old, familiar grip, fingers clenched, as if letting go would break him. I lost the thread of the ceremony for a moment. The minister said something. Ryan answered. People laughed lightly, but I was far away, not in anger, not even in shock, but in the ache of a question I wasn't prepared to feel again. What would have happened if I had just let him in? He didn't interrupt, didn't wave, didn't ask for attention. He simply stood still at the back of the room, watching the same way he always had. Quietly, painfully, completely. I felt a tear roll down my cheek. It wasn't sadness. It was the weight of years that had tried to stay buried, but now rose up with no intention of being silenced. The minister looked at me kindly, then back at Ryan. We continued, but the whole time I felt it, the gravity of that presence in the doorway, like a missing note that had finally, gently been played. When the ceremony ended and applause rose like soft thunder, I turned with everyone else, bouquet raised, veil trailing behind me, and the back of the church was empty again. Gone, just like that, like he had only come to make sure it was real, to see me really see me, before I stepped into a life he would no longer be part of, and then he left without needing a seat, without needing to be forgiven, just needing to be there. Studio Chapter 10, The Confession That Broke the Room. The reception hall glowed with candlelight. Crystal glasses clinked, laughter spilled across the tables, and music floated in gentle waves. It should have been perfect. It was perfect, at least on the surface. But beneath it all there was a hum, a low, invisible tension that seemed to press against the air. I felt it every time my eyes flicked toward the door, every time I thought of that shadow standing at the back of the church, and how quickly it had vanished. We cut the cake. We toasted. People danced. And then, during dinner, the venue manager quietly approached me. "Mrs. Carter," she said softly, using my new name. "Could I speak to you for a moment?" Confused, I followed her to the side of the room. She held a folder in her hands, pressed close to her chest as if it were something delicate. "These are the receipts," she explained. "For the venue, the music, the catering, everything. I thought you'd want them for your records." I frowned. "But Ryan and I haven't even." She cut me off with a careful smile. "You don't need to, it's all been covered. By the same gentleman. He insisted on anonymity, but I saw him at the door earlier. He watched you walk down the aisle. I thought you should know." The room blurred. The laughter, the music, it all faded into a distant hum. I opened the folder. There, in bold ink across every invoice, was the same name. David Wilson, my father. I stood frozen, bouquet wilting in my hands. Ryan came to my side, his brow furrowed. "Emily, what is it?" I couldn't answer, so I handed him the papers. His eyes widened, then softened. He looked at me the way you look at someone carrying more than they can hold. Across the room, Olivia noticed my stillness. She started to approach, but Ryan shook his head gently. This moment wasn't for anyone else. I stared at the receipts again. Line after line, signature after signature. Proof that the man I'd left off my guest list had been behind every detail of this night. The flowers, the music, the food on every plate, every laugh, every toast, every beautiful thing that people would remember about this wedding, had been quietly placed there by the man I swore I no longer needed. I pressed the papers to my chest and whispered to no one in particular. He paid for my wedding, and I didn't even give him a seat. The words broke inside me as they left my lips, and suddenly I was crying. Not the soft, graceful kind of tears brides are expected to shed, but the kind that shakes your body and leaves silence in its wake. The music stopped, the room stilled, and for the first time that day, every single person turned their eyes not to me, but to the absence I had tried so hard to hide. I felt Ryan's hand slip into mine, warm, steady. "Emily," he whispered, "maybe it's not too late." Studio Chapter 11, The Flood of Memories. Grief has a way of keeping boxes closed. You tell yourself you've put something away for good, but all it takes is a single key, and suddenly everything spills out. For me, that key was a stack of receipts, so ordinary, so undeniable. I sat in the bridal suite, the folder on my lap, and memories I had buried for decades began to push their way back. Not grand memories, not the kind you frame or tell at reunions, but small ones. The mornings I used to wake up to the sound of his boots on the porch. The way he would whistle, always a little off-key, while fixing the screen door. The smell of sawdust on his jacket when he hugged me good night. I had forgotten those things, or maybe I had chosen to forget, because remembering them meant admitting he had been there once, and that made his absence hurt even more. I thought of the envelopes I never opened, dozens of them, some still sitting in that shoebox at home. What had he written in all those years? Happy birthdays, congratulations, apologies, and why had I been so afraid to read them? I closed my eyes, and another picture surfaced, my college graduation. I had scanned the crowd that day, convinced he hadn't shown. I told myself I was right, that his empty seat was proof of everything I already believed about him. But now, with the weight of these receipts in my hands, I remembered something else. A rusted blue truck parked 2 blocks away. Windows fogged from someone sitting too long in the driver's seat. It had been him. It must have been. He had been there, just not where I wanted him to be. Tears slid down my cheeks and smudged the ink on the invoices. Each signature looked more fragile now, like the handwriting of a man who kept trying, even when no one asked him to. There was a knock on the door, Ryan's voice, gentle. "Em, they are waiting for you, the first dance." I swallowed hard, wiped at my eyes, and whispered back, "I just need a minute." But it wasn't the dance I was thinking about. It wasn't the music. It wasn't even the wedding anymore. It was him, always him. The man who stood in shadows, the man who paid in silence. The man I told myself I didn't need, and yet somehow was in every corner of this day, and for the first time in years, I whispered out loud the word I had been holding back. Dad, not in anger, not in blame, but in something softer, like a prayer, like an answer, like a beginning. Studio Chapter 12. The tears that stopped the music. The music began softly, a slow song, the kind meant for first dances and photographs. Guests circled the floor with their phones ready, waiting for the perfect moment to capture the bride and groom swaying under the lights. Ryan took my hand, smiling gently. His eyes said, "We'll be okay." His lips whispered, "Just breathe." And for a few seconds I tried. We moved together in rhythm, his hand steady on my back, my veil brushing against the polished floor. But then, the folder slipped from the chair beside me. Pages scattered across the hardwood. Receipts, contracts, his name. David Wilson, Everywhere I froze. The room kept spinning, but I couldn't. Not anymore. A sob tore through me, raw and uninvited. The kind you can't hide, the kind that stops conversations mid-sentence. The music faltered, then stopped entirely. The band looked at one another, unsure what to do, and suddenly the whole room was silent, all eyes on me, the bride, crying in the middle of her first dance. I dropped to my knees, gathering the papers with shaking hands, as if putting them back together would undo the truth written on them. But the truth was already out. Some guests whispered, others gasped. Ryan knelt beside me, his arm wrapping protectively around my shoulders. He didn't try to stop the tears, he just held me. "I can't," I choked, clutching one crumpled page. He did all of this, every flower, every song, every piece of today, and my voice broke. I didn't even give him a chair. Olivia rushed forward, crouching in her bridesmaid dress, her hand on mine. "Emily, honey," she whispered. But she didn't finish, because there was nothing left to say. And then, from the back of the hall, a sound, not a word, not a cough, just the faint scrape of a chair being pulled out. The crowd turned, and there he was, my father, not in the doorway this time, not watching from a distance, but stepping forward, his hands trembling, his eyes shining with something between sorrow and love. He wasn't hiding anymore. And in that instant, the silence broke, not with music, but with the sound of my heart remembering what it meant to be someone's daughter. Studio Chapter 13, The Groom's Hand. He stood at the edge of the room, not moving, not speaking, as if one wrong step might shatter the fragile air between us. My father, the man I had exiled, the man who had chosen silence for so many years, the man who had paid for every piece of this day and still believed he had no right to claim a seat at it. I couldn't move either. I stayed on the floor, veil pooling around me, papers scattered at my knees. My breath caught somewhere between anger and forgiveness, between the past I couldn't erase, and the present I wasn't ready to accept. Ryan stood slowly. He looked at me, then at him, and without hesitation he crossed the room. I watched, frozen, as my husband, still in his suit, still glowing with the weight of vows spoken only an hour before, walked past rows of tables, past the wide-eyed stares of family and friends, and stopped in front of my father. For a moment they simply stood there, two men bound by the same woman, one who had raised her and lost her trust, the other who had just promised to hold her for the rest of his life. Then Ryan extended his hand. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment it carried everything. Welcome, recognition, forgiveness. A bridge between two shores that had been drifting apart for decades. My father stared at it like it was something fragile, something he wasn't sure he deserved to touch. But then slowly, almost painfully, he lifted his own hand and placed it in Ryan's. The room exhaled. Whispers turned into tears, tears into silence, silence into something deeper, respect. Ryan didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply turned, still holding my father's hand, and led him across the floor, until they stood in front of me. I looked up. For the first time in years, I met his eyes. They weren't hard or distant or filled with excuses. They were the eyes of a man who had been waiting for permission to love his daughter again, and suddenly all I could think was, this is what I wanted, not the flowers, not the music, not the perfect photographs, just this. Ryan placed my father's hand gently in mine, and then he whispered, just for us, "She's yours too." Studio Chapter 14, The Long-Awaited Embrace. For a moment, no one breathed. His hand was in mine now, warm, trembling, calloused from years of work. It didn't feel like the hand of a stranger. It felt like something I had been missing without admitting it. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not the man who had failed me, but the man who had tried awkwardly, silently, imperfectly. The man who had written letters I never opened, who had sat in a truck outside graduations, who had paid for flowers and music so his daughter could have the day she deserved, even if she didn't want him there. Dad. The word slipped out before I could stop it, small, broken, but real. His eyes filled instantly. It was as if he had been waiting years, decades, just to hear me call him that again. And then it happened. I stood, dropped the crumpled receipts from my hands, and stepped into his arms. At first, his embrace was hesitant, like he was afraid I might pull away. But I didn't. I held tighter. And when I did, he folded into me, shoulders shaking, chest heaving, clutching me the way a father clutches a child he thought he had lost forever. The room broke. Guests sobbed openly. Olivia covered her mouth with her hands. Even the band set down their instruments, some wiping their own eyes. It wasn't a father crashing a wedding anymore. It was a father and daughter finding their way back to each other in front of everyone. And somehow, it felt like the whole world was witnessing it too. "I'm sorry," he whispered into my hair. "God, Emily, I'm so sorry." I pressed my face into his chest, breathing in the faint scent of sawdust and old cologne, the smell of home, the smell of a man who had never really left, only lingered in the margins where I refused to see him. And then just like that, the silence turned into applause, not polite, not rehearsed, but the kind of applause that rises when people realize they've just seen something sacred. Ryan stood a few steps back, tears on his face too, nodding at me as if to say, "This is where you belong. This is what you needed." For the first time in years, I wasn't angry. I wasn't abandoned. I wasn't broken. I was just a daughter, and in my father's arms, that was enough. Studio Chapter 15, The Mother's Ring. The applause faded, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, sacred, like the hush of a church after a prayer. My father pulled back slightly, his hand still on my shoulders, eyes searching mine as though he was afraid the moment would vanish if he blinked. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers trembled as he drew out a small velvet box, old, frayed at the edges, the kind of box that doesn't hold jewelry as much as it holds history. "I've carried this for years," he said softly, his voice breaking in the middle. "Waiting for the right day. Waiting for your day." He opened it. Inside was a ring, simple, gold, worn with time. But set in the band was a small diamond, nothing flashy, just enough to catch the light. I knew it instantly. My mother's wedding ring. The sight of it cracked something open in me. The room blurred, the flowers, the tables, even Ryan's face, all softened at the edges. All I could see was that ring. I remembered it on her hand, how it would glint when she stirred a pot of soup, how she would twist it absent-mindedly while reading me bedtime stories, how she once kissed it before saying good night, as if sealing a promise I was too young to understand. My father's voice shook. "She wanted you to have it. I promised her I'd keep it safe until this day, and I almost failed you, but I never let go of this." He held out the box, not pushing it into my hands, but offering it the way you offer something sacred. I reached out, my fingers brushing the velvet, and for a moment, it felt like both my parents were in the room, one through memory, one through presence. Ryan stepped closer. His hand touched mine, steadying me, and together we lifted the ring from its box. I slipped it onto my other hand, not the one bearing my new wedding band, but the one that still felt bare, still waiting for something older, something deeper. The gold was cool against my skin, but it warmed almost instantly, as if it recognized me. Tears slipped down my father's face. He whispered almost to himself, "She's here with us. You know she never left." And for the first time in all the years since her passing, I believed him. The guests didn't clap this time. No one moved. They didn't need to, because the moment didn't belong to them. It belonged to us. To a mother, a father, and a daughter, woven together again through a circle of gold. Studio Chapter 16, The Final Vow. Weddings are built on vows. Promises between two people spoken aloud, sealed before witnesses. But that night, standing with Ryan's hand in mine and my father's tears still wet on my shoulder, I realized there was another vow to make. Not to my husband, not to the guests, but to the man I once refused to see. The man who never stopped seeing me. I turned to him. My voice trembled, but it carried. I thought I lost you. I thought I didn't need you. But today I understand. Love doesn't disappear just because it gets quiet. You were there even when I couldn't bear to look. And I don't want to spend another day pretending you're not part of me. I don't want to lose you twice. The room was silent again, but it wasn't the silence of grief anymore. It was the silence of respect, of hearts bending toward something true. My father nodded, unable to speak, but in his eyes I saw it. The vow returned, unspoken but unshakable. That night, when the music resumed and the laughter filled the hall again, I danced between two men, the one I had chosen to build a life with, and the one who had given me life in the first place. And for the first time since I was 7 years old, I felt whole. Love isn't always neat. It doesn't always arrive when you want it or in the form you expect. Sometimes it hides in shadows, writes letters that go unread, or pays for flowers you didn't know you needed. But love, real love, waits. It waits for the day you're finally ready to see it again. Thank you, dear listeners, for walking through this story with me. May it remind you to look twice at the people in your life, to see the love that's there, even when it's quiet, even when it comes late. From our family here at Twist of Revenge to yours, we wish you health, happiness, and the kind of family ties that hold strong. No matter how many years or how many silences try to stretch between them, take care. And may love always find its way back to you.